Hey, Joe, I have a question for you right out the gate here.
Okay, go ahead.
Nice. I want to know, you do a lot of deals. You do the most at Quiet Light Brokerage, I think, in terms of dollar amount. What percentage of your deals would you say are done through SBA lending?
That's a good question, and I feel like I'm unprepared statistically, but the larger deals are more SBA oriented. The thing I'm seeing is that more deals are eligible for the SBA than ever in the past, and the ultimate point I think is that it's better for buyers to use an SBA loan because they get 10-year repayment period, and it's often better for sellers because buyers are willing to pay more on an SBA loan than they are if they're cash buyers. So I think it's depends upon the size, but more and more transactions are eligible for SBA.
Yeah, so I've been doing this for 10 years now. And when I started up Quiet Light Brokerage, we were mainly doing really small deals. So we weren't doing the seven-figure deals at that point in time. And I may have had one or two early on that wanted to go through SBA lending, or any bank loan for that matter. And then when the recession hit in 2008, 2009, 2010, around that time, it completely vanished. And I remember I actually went to lunch with two vice presidents at Wells Fargo to talk about their lending program. And I left that lunch just understanding that no one in the banking industry knew what they were doing and what the limits were. SBA lending just completely dried up, but that's changed over the past few years. And I mean,
And it's changing again in 2018.
yeah,
The lending limits are going to change so that it puts buyers on the same playing field as cash buyers because it's changing. It's going to be tiered, as you'll learn in the interview here. But you can come to the table as a buyer with 10% on many deals and not require any seller note at all. The SBA is going to bring 90% of the funds to the deal instead of the historical 75. So it's really good for buyers, really good for sellers.
yeah. And if anyone listening to this or watching this wants to understand what some of the restrictions and the ratios and everything else, we have a guide on our website that I wrote last year in 2017. We're going to update it again for 2018, and there's a downloadable package as well that has some of the basic forms. If you're listening in, when you get back to a computer, you can go to quietlightbrokerage.com/SBA-loan, and it'll bring you to the page. But we'll update that with some of the new guidelines. But they are changing in 2018. They're really favorable for buyers.
Yeah, they're definitely favorable. On that document that you're mentioning, one of the things that we've got in there are two or three different options for SBA lenders for listeners to reach out to, which is really important. And one thing I do, and this is one drawback to our website, and I'll throw us under the bus at the moment, is you can't go to the website and do a search for items. So if you go to Google and do a search for Quiet Light and SBA, that same article will come up.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And as far as those lenders are concerned, just so people know, we don't actually get a kickback on those. These are people that we've done deals with. We've dealt with a lot of bad SBA lenders, so we like to only recommend SBA lenders that we know can get the deal done. And one of those guys is Speer, who you talked to for this interview, right?
Yes, Steven is a laid back, comfortable guy. He's a lender, not a banker, and he talks about that in the interview. But my experience so far, and probably everybody listening with bankers, sorry to throw bankers under the bus here, but there has a tendency to overpromise and underdeliver, especially when it comes to SBA loans. I had a transaction that closed with a different lender that we don't recommend anymore. That was a small transaction. It was like $250,000. It took about 90 days to close. And I swear the buyer and the seller were practically suicidal by the time it was done. And I'm not kidding. There were so many emotions and the roller coaster of emotions. With this transaction with Steven, I put a listing under LOI October 27th, and we got a commitment letter 34 days later from his bank, which means that they are committed to funding the loan. The third-party valuation has been done, and it's approved, and we're 2 weeks away from closing. Now, historically, we talk about cash transaction closing in roughly 30 to 40 days. This is a transaction that is SBA that's now going to close in about 45 days. So it puts you on that same playing field as cash buyers. So I think it's fantastic for buyers. I think it's fantastic for sellers.
Yeah, and the one last point I'm going to make as far as just the benefits of this, if anyone wants to know why do we recommend SBA loans or as an avenue, from a buying standpoint, you have to put relatively little money up front, only 10% of the purchase price up front. You get to amortize that or spread that out over a 10-year payback period. So there's lots of benefits for buyers. For sellers, a lot of times sellers have been scared about doing these loans because they think, well, it's no guarantee it's going to go through. There's a seller note. That's what this interview is going to cover. It's going to cover some of the changes, which are really favorable for sellers as well. And it boosts the price up on these businesses because there's more buyers that are able to do the acquisition. So there's all sorts of benefits for both buyers and sellers now that SBA lending is loosening up.
I agree. Enough of you and me. Let's get to the interview.
Absolutely.
Hey, Stephen, welcome to the Quiet Life Podcast.
Thanks for having me. Appreciate it, Joe.
Good to have you here, man. Hey, listen, I'm going to toot your horn real quickly, and then we're going to get into the interview. But I just got an email this morning, and I have to tell people listening, when it comes to SBA deals, my experience is it's going to take 60 to 90 days to close. Generally speaking, SBA lenders overpromise on those time frames and underdeliver. That's my experience until working with you. I did the math this morning. We went under letter of intent on a $2.3 million deal 31 days ago. And yes, you guys submitted the commitment letter today, and we're going to close in 2 weeks. It's 45 days. Incredible. So
thank you.
Kudos to you. I want everybody to pay attention and listen to this because the SBA lending aspect of buying an online business or selling an online business is becoming more and more prevalent, and things are going to change even for the better, I think, in 2018, and we'll touch on that.
I think so.
Good. So, Stephen Speer, Bank United, why don't you give us a little bit of background, tell us about your experience and what you do for a living.
Well, I've been lending for 25 years, and I'm originally from Southern California. I spent 20 years in Chicago in finance, and then moved down here to Tampa about 5 years ago. I have pretty extensive SBA experience and more defined within the bank, within the business acquisition space, e-commerce business acquisition space. I enjoy it. I've had great experience with some of my referral sources and my buyers, my sellers. It's worked out really well.
And you work for Bank United, right?
I work for Bank United and have for 2 years.
Okay. So those watching, they're doing renovation at your office today. So you're working from home like a true entrepreneur.
Yes, next door to my office, they're pounding away and I just can't stand it. So I'm here at my home and have my very large golden retriever here at my feet, and hopefully he doesn't bark during this podcast.
Well, if he does, the entrepreneurs listening will think that you're just like them because we all generally have a pet or two kicking around somewhere. So just tell us about the SBA, what it stands for, and who they generally lend to in this situation and how it works. Give us.
Okay, so the SBA is Small Business Administration. What they basically do is they allow lenders to take a greater risk on their lending because they guarantee 75% of that loan. So it allows for greater expansion for small businesses. And as you know, Joe, small businesses are the base of the United States of America. So the government stepped in and basically offsets any additional risk when it deals with perhaps collateral or down payment, et cetera, and allows really, it's basically a conduit to help our country increase small business lending. And, they've done, I think overall done a very good job at that. And I think, I could toot Bank United, it's been a very good experience with them, and I've been able to form basically an e-commerce lending team around me where all of us, including third-party vendors, know the e-commerce space, and we're able to help not only buyers obtain e-commerce financing, but also be able to help sellers maximize their price point because we're able to open up more doors for more buyers and ergo increase asking prices.
Right. Generally speaking, SBA buyers are willing and able to pay a little bit more than a cash buyer because 75% of the purchase price is on a 10-year note.
Yes.
through the SBA. So let's talk about that in terms of buyers and sellers. But first, just to reiterate what you said, you've got an e-commerce lending team that focuses on e-commerce and all around the SBA. I want buyers to understand that. So a lot of misinformation out there that the SBA will not lend to e-commerce business buyers or on e-commerce businesses. It's absolutely false.
Well, it's a little bit different than that. It's not that the SBA doesn't lend in this space. It's that most lenders don't lend in this space. But Bank United, being an aggressive bank, does lend in this space because we understand this space. We understand, Joe, that the multiples are going to be higher than traditional brick and mortar. You know, we understand that there's not going to be collateral. We understand a lot of nuances within the e-commerce space, and we're quite honestly able to do a lot better job than even lenders within this space.
Well, I'll second that based upon my experience with you so far. Bank United is what's called a preferred lender. Is that right?
Yes, and what that means, Joe, is that everything's done in-house following the SBA guidelines. So it doesn't mean that the loan goes to this black hole known as the SBA and it never comes out. We actually underwrite everything in-house. We fund everything in-house. It's just that it just means that the loan itself has a guarantee, has essentially an insurance policy on it against default, which allows the lender to be a little bit more aggressive than standard lending.
Okay. One thing that's always asked of me when I'm at events and conferences is how does a buyer that doesn't have all cash compete with those cash buyers? And I think the SBA lending aspect is a critical part of it. Can you touch on buyer qualifications? What does it take someone in terms of their qualifications if they want to buy a $200,000, $1 million, $2 million SBA business? What kind of qualifications do they have to have?
Well, first off, in terms of a non-cash buyer, does a seller really care where the money is coming from as long as they know confidently that there aren't going to be any financing hiccups? And secondly, in most cases, a buyer or a seller is going to be able to sell a business for a higher price than someone coming in with cash. And generally, correct me if I'm wrong, financed people coming in with offers that are being financed generally are a little bit more aggressive than a cash buyer, I would venture to say.
In terms of the price. No, you're
not
wrong.
In terms of the price, yeah.
You're not wrong. Yeah.
So in terms of qualification, kind of two pieces. The first piece is how does the buyer qualify? And ultimately we look at, income. If there is any secondary income, we look at assets in the bank and also how much assets that person will have after closing once he does put in his injection or down payment. We look at that. We look at credit. And we'll look a little bit at collateral, but again, SBA doesn't require any collateral, but it does help strengthen the deal. So we do look at those things. And then, so that's the one piece, Joe. And the second piece is we look at the actual business. Does it cash flow based on the structure of the deal? And so we look at that piece. So it's kind of two different pieces, unlike when you purchase a residence where it's just ultimately up to the borrower or buyer. Does that person qualify? You have two pieces, buyer and seller. Does a seller qualify? Does a buyer qualify? And
right.
That's how we bring it all together.
Right. And on the buyer side, again, I want to emphasize that it's not complicated. You're there. You have 25 years of experience. Just like it's not complicated for me to list and sell an online business. I do it every day. You do this every day, and you walk people through this process step by step. And again, the big thing in terms of what you said earlier, does a seller really care because they're going to get the same amount of money at closing, maybe more from an SBA lender? The big difference historically, in my experience up until working with you, has been that it's going to take twice as long to close an SBA deal as it is a cash deal. Well, you've changed that in that, I've got again, this one we're talking about today, 2.3 million, 45 days, and we're going to be closing, which is generally, cash windows. It's 30 to 45 days, depending upon attorneys and holidays and things of that nature. And by the way, for the listening audience, within that 45-day period, of course, again, we haven't closed it yet. We're 2 weeks out. Within that 45 days fell the week of Thanksgiving. So if we didn't have that week of Thanksgiving, we probably would have done it.
We probably would be closed right now.
Right. So it's really impressive. All right. So from a buyer standpoint, you've got the experience. You'll hold their hand. You'll help them the entire way through. They've got to have some assets, some cash flow, some collateral, if you will. Yeah. What about experience? And let me just touch this real quick. I had a business under letter of intent, SBA deal, different lender. They absolutely had good qualifications on paper, 2 Harvard MBAs with 0 life experience, but they had a great education. Preliminary, it looked great, but the underwriting team turned them down. Tell me about the experience that a buyer has to have in order to, get approved for a loan with the SBA.
It's almost like going for a job. Okay. So you have to ask the right questions. You have to try to extract a skill set from the given buyers and be able to put them almost like a puzzle into what's going to be required in running an e-commerce company. So it really has to do with question asking. And what I normally do, if it is a little bit of a stretch in terms of someone not having direct e-commerce experience, I have an interview with them, and I really try to extract skill sets that would be very good attributes within the e-commerce space. And I also ask questions like, do you plan on bringing somebody in that really knows SEO, or do you plan, what kind of team are you going to have around you? And honestly, I've done e-commerce deals with CPAs, meaning a CPA got sick of working for a large accounting firm and started his own e-commerce business. So generally, I've never had a situation, again, asking the right questions, where someone's going to be shot out and shut down because of previous experience.
Yeah, it's funny, as I'm hearing you talk about this, those particular buyers are probably not listening to this podcast because they're not in the internet space right now anyway. But for those that are, or have friends that are, myself and Steven, basically what you're saying is we help them prepare for that ultimate interview with the underwriter who makes the decision whether that buyer is a good enough risk for you to lend them money.
And candidly, I coach them. I say, here's some of the things to really emphasize during the interview. And so I'm able to coach them. So when the interview, and by the way, guys out there is an interview between the buyer and the underwriter, but it's more of an introduction. It's not interrogation. We don't put hot lights on the given individual. It's actually kind of a get to know you, and also where do you see this business going? And it really helps the underwriter, and it also helps the buyer. I think it's very constructive. It's a very good interview. And for example, on the deal that we just got the commitment letter on today, my underwriter loves Nathan, and it made him feel very comfortable with not only moving forward with the loan, but getting things done very quickly to be able to meet Nathan's time frame on taking over the business. So it worked very well.
Good. So from a seller's perspective, let's talk about that. A business itself, if somebody's listening to this and they're thinking, I want to cast the broadest net of potential buyers, and therefore the way to do that is to get my business qualified for an SBA loan, not necessarily pre-qualified, but generally speaking, what type of business, what age, what size, all of those things is going to qualify for an SBA loan?
Excellent question, Joe. First off, what I generally do is request, and I'll start off with what I try to get up front, maybe even prior to the seller listing his business or her business, is I try to get financials and be able to look at the track record of the business. But generally speaking, I'm looking for one solid year of tax returns that are able to carry the debt service of the given loan. Right now it would be a strong 2016, and really good year-to-date numbers for 2017 would be enough. We look at other aspects. Maybe 15 was a ramp-up year, 16 they're knocking it out of the park, and 17 continue to knock it out of the park. That's what we're looking for, which is very converse with other lenders where they require 3 years. Well, Joe, you know as well as I do, within the e-commerce space, that you're not going to have 3 years track record generally, because most sellers within the e-commerce space are selling their businesses within those 3 years, because the trajectory of the sales are going up in very large multiples. And secondly, they're looking for that next business to create and grow. So, so that in terms of
I'm with you on that 3-year point. I've talked to other lenders and they absolutely need 3 years. So again, to the people listening, Stephen said 1 year of tax returns and another ramp up year. So right now we are December 2017. So what you could say is 2016 returns and year to date 2017, you'd be in pretty good shape.
Right. And right now I have one business in particular where, 2016 was a ramp up year. The numbers were good, but it didn't support the debt service just quite enough. But 2017, they're crushing it. So what I instructed them to do is as soon as it's 2018, get those tax returns submitted to the IRS so we're able to use those tax returns for qualification. And I know some sellers go, well, I have year-to-date financials or year-ending financials. That's all good, but what did you submit to the IRS? That's really what lenders are looking for. It's great that you have QuickBooks and can provide the lender QuickBook year-to-date or year-ending financials, but it's really all about the tax returns. It really
Okay.
is.
Let's touch on that real quickly because, as you know, when a entrepreneur is running a business for themselves, they want to minimize their taxes as much as possible. They present a profit and loss to me. Let's say the business is making $500,000, but they pay themselves a salary of 100. Now they're at 400 in net, let's call it. They have their car, their meals and entertainment, trip to Disney with the family, a number of things that they write through the business. Those are written off on the tax returns, but on the profit and loss statement that we create, these are personal benefits to the owner and we add them back. So the net income plus the add backs equals the total seller's discretionary earnings, which is the multiple, what is the number that the multiples apply to. Do you as a banker look at the tax returns and then say, okay, well, look, here's the salary. This is clearly personal, and create a little bit of an add back schedule yourself?
Oh, absolutely. And that's part and parcel with e-commerce. Actually, just about any business acquisition deals. That's the first thing I look. Even I could just tell by looking at Schedule C's where, I'm able to add certain things back, but more importantly, when I get the corporate returns, a non-Schedule C situation where I'm able to really add things back. And it could be one-time expenses for starting up a website or whatever it may be. I'm able to add those things back. Obviously, interest would be an add back, amortization, depreciation. And yeah, the trip to the Bahamas, I'm able to add back. So, a lot of people want to minimize their exposure to taxation. We all get it. Sometimes they get a little out of hand, but for the most part, I'm able to do those add backs and be able to push the ball forward.
Okay. So it's okay as a business owner to run business as normal, get those entrepreneurial benefits that you normally get.
Right.
What's wrong though, what they shouldn't do is, tell me, commingle two different businesses together and they're only trying to sell one and it's under one tax return. Is that right?
That is a recipe for disaster. Yes. And quite honestly, a lot of speakers during e-commerce events that I've been privy to are bringing that fact up when they're in front of a group of sellers. They're like, don't do that. And also they're trying to get sellers off of Schedule C's and do formal business tax returns. And so that's helped. So yes, commingling is really makes a lender run for the hills oftentimes, or involves a lot more work and the lender and seller working through those to be able to kind of extract what's really being sold. So that makes it a lot more difficult in that respect. But I mean, I'm not saying it's a deal killer, but definitely makes things a lot harder and it pushes the timetable out because sometimes they have to get their CPA involved. Sometimes I have to do my own analysis. It's really time intensive.
Yeah. So when we talk about the transaction that you and I are closing in a couple of weeks, again, LOI to closing, roughly 45 days. This business had clean tax returns, an experienced seller, a buyer that had recently sold a business in the spring and understood how to put a business plan together very quickly and did the paperwork. When you have a business where you're not planning to sell it and you commingle two different businesses together under one tax return, it is not going to take 45 days. Tell me, as a preferred lender, I always say this as we throw bankers under the bus, I'm sorry, but we say that
I'm used to it. It's been 25 years.
You've got a bunch of boxes to check as an SBA lender. You have to check all of those boxes, and if they don't all check off, then it's my understanding that you have to say, look, I can't check them all off. We have to send the package out to California to the SBA, and they have to look at it to make the final decision. Is that accurate? I've had it happen once that way with another lender, but it was
never.
You.
Rarely.
Okay.
Rarely. Yeah.
So you just say yes or no?
Honestly, we understand e-commerce more than any minimum wage person in California at the SBA. I hate to say it that way, but we know how to structure deals. If we can't get it done, it's not going to be done by the SBA. I mean, they're not. Anyway, I'm gonna stop right there.
Don't want to get yourself in trouble.
I don't want to be audited.
They're not listening. It's okay.
But back to commingling. I've had it where they were able to get a CPA involved and really, provide a very clear accounting documentation, uncommingling the two businesses or the multiple businesses. So it's not a never going to happen thing. It's just, if you're doing it, please stop and please go to your accountant and have everything, untangled, because I'll tell you, any cost of doing that, you'll make it up on the back end when you go to sell your business.
I say that every day. I say accounting, Excel is not accounting software. That's the bookkeeper every single day. And I see the positive return on investment. I've seen a business that I had for sale for $750,000. We were under LOI 4 times and they fell through because the financials were all done strictly in Excel. They took all that same information, put it into QuickBooks, same information, exported it to Excel. Guess what? It sold for more money, and the guy spent $1,500 in a bookkeeper. So anybody listening, please hire a bookkeeper. Shoot me an email. I have a great one I can refer you to. Let's talk about the protection that the SBA or you as an underwriter gives to the buyer. You do a lot of work on behalf of the buyer, in my opinion, and I think you're helping them make a better investment and a better choice by being sort of their backup due diligence team. Would that be an accurate description?
That is completely accurate, because if you're purchasing a business for $500,000 or $1 million or whatever the number is, we're going to make sure that business is worth $500,000 or $1 million or whatever the purchase price is. So we hire a third party, independent party who does a business valuation, who understands e-commerce. Huge difference between that and brick and mortar, as you all know. So we have him do or her do the valuation. They come back with the valuation, and it's not one of those things where it always comes back at the purchase price, and they do a lot of due diligence on that end. Additionally, I've had clients, especially on very, very large deals, actually hire someone who does e-commerce due diligence. So they don't evaluate it, but they comb through the financials and try to poke holes in the financials. And so I've seen that as well. So kind of two layers of due diligence.
I'm gonna plug a company that we've worked with before independently. It's called Centurica with a C.
Yes.
And then Chris Yates owns the company. They do exactly that. If you're a buyer and you want to make a business purchase and you want a backup due diligence team beyond what the SBA would do if you're doing an SBA deal, Centurica is great for that. They actually will do a pre-due diligence check for sellers as well, so you can help prepare your business for sale. A couple of things I want to touch on. We really didn't hit it early on. From a buyer's perspective or a seller's perspective, today in 2017, the SBA is going to come up with 75%. How much does the buyer and seller have to come up with in order to close a transaction? And I know that it's never set in stone. So talk to me about that for a minute.
Well, I'm glad that you brought that up, Joe. So typically it's 25% injection or down payment. So on the business loan side, it's called an injection. So I'll just go with that. And typically it's 10 or 15% from a buyer and 10 or 15% from the seller in the form of a seller note. That unfortunately and fortunately, kind of depending on how you view it, is going away in 2018. The good news is that the seller, in most cases, and depending on loan size, the buyer, depending on loan size, will only have to come up with 10% injection, and there will be no seller injection requirement.
Okay, so historically, on the transactions that I've done, the seller has to carry a 10% seller note.
Yeah,
yes. For the sellers, that means that if you're selling your business for $1 million, you're not getting $1 million. You're getting $900,000. You're going to loan the buyer $100,000, and they're going to repay that loan to you with a standby over a 5 or 10 year period. You're second to the SBA. So the good news is, from the buyer's perspective and the seller's perspective, is that in the coming years, an e-commerce business can be purchased with 10% down, and the seller is going to get 100% of the funds at closing.
Right. Yes.
So that's absolutely putting the buyer of that business in the exact same cash position, or same position as a cash buyer. Actually better, because 90% of their loan, their purchase is going to be spread over a 10-year repayment period.
Right. Yes. So that's right. So it's from a buyer's and seller standpoint, it's I think a home run. The only drawback is, I think it's going to be tiered, and it's not set in stone yet, but I think loans above $1 million, maybe it requires the buyer to put in 15% instead of 10.
Okay.
Any loans above $2 million, it's going to be maybe 20, but ultimately it's going to be less than 25. It's not going to be required. Having a seller note is not going to be a requirement, which some sellers just won't do it. And really, basically, ultimately, because in terms of e-commerce business financing, SBA is the only way to go. Like, there is no other types of financing other than maybe hard money, which, obviously that's a lot higher interest rate. So from that standpoint, I think it'll bring in more buyers that'll be open to having more sellers more open to someone coming in with financing, because they're not going to have to do that seller note.
Right. Absolutely. Let's talk about the size of the loans that you do. Some buyers may say, look, we're talking pretty big numbers here, 2.3 million, $1 million. What size transactions will you do as a lender?
We, as of right now, we go well beyond most lenders. We feel pretty comfortable up to about a $5 million loan. Obviously, it involves a lot higher, with those higher numbers, it involves a lot higher cash injection or down payment.
Sure.
But I know a lot of lenders are limited at $2 million. I've done several loans above the $2 million threshold. And also, we look at the strength of the buyer. And so we look at that. A lot of different variables, but with the right buyer, we go pretty darn higher than most people will even go. So
what about for the average buyer that's out there that is thinking, or seller that has a business that's $250,000 or $500,000? Do you work with those types of businesses on an SBA loan process?
Yes. So for example, right now I'm working on a loan. It's a $250,000 e-commerce purchase. Buyers doing, in this case, 5%, sellers doing the other 5%. And it's such a small loan that it's going to be allowed. And I'm kind of placing under 2018 guidelines. But anyway, so that's one example.
Okay, obviously, so you'll do smaller ones for sure. I think that seller's kind of nuts. He's doing 5%, $12,500 spread over 5 years. It's not even going to buy him a cup of coffee.
I know.
But it is what it is.
So I do the smaller ones, and quite honestly, they tend to be a little bit more difficult because the business acumen of both buyer and seller tends to be little less than someone that maybe a $2 or $3 million range. But overall, I like helping people. I like getting being involved with those types of business acquisitions and having them grow over time. I've had buyers 2-3 years ago, triple, quadruple their business in that time frame. So that's a lot of fun for me.
Well, I agree. I've seen it happen as well. I think that the fact that you love helping people is the key thing. Again, we're running a little short on time here, so I want to wrap up just a little bit, Stephen. But, for those listening, Stephen is a banker, right? But he's not your typical banker. I know you shrug your shoulders and no.
I'm a lender. I'm a lender. Don't call me a banker. I don't work for a bank.
At a bank. But you communicate better than anyone that I've worked with before. You deliver on your time frames. You think outside the box. You don't just check those boxes and say, it doesn't fit, I can't do it. You and I have tried to get creative on a few different deals, still within the SBA guidelines, but still you're working to do that. So from the buyers and sellers perspective, I think it's important to understand that the buyers, they can buy a business with as little as 10% down. From the seller's perspective, they can sell their business and get 100% of the sale price, beginning in 2018. And generally speaking, SBA buyers are willing to pay a little bit more than a cash buyer because they've got a 10-year repayment period on that note. One thing that just crossed my mind, cost. What is it going to cost somebody out of pocket to go down the SBA route in terms of making a purchase? Do they have to spend money before closing? What's the situation there in the cost?
So what I normally do is take a deposit, and that deposit goes towards third-party fees. And what those third-party fees are, the business valuation. There's typically a home appraisal involved, and title work and attorneys and so forth. Generally, it's about $12,000. And all that is actually financed into the loan. So at the end of the day, my buyers are coming up with the 10%. They're not coming up 10 plus this plus that. So it's $12,000. And then there's an SBA fee that is also incurred. It's like an insurance premium that also gets financed into the loan. And that varies, but generally it's 3.5%.
Okay.
So,
what happens if the valuation, they give that deposit of $12,000 and the deal falls apart for some reason? Is that money lost, or can they use it towards the next purchase?
Towards the next, and then I just had that happen on buyer and seller just couldn't come to agreement, so it moved on to the next deal. So it gets forwarded. Okay. As long as no costs are incurred. Come on. My dog needs to go to the bathroom. He is. There he is.
Good. I thought you were lying about the goal. That's great.
So there are costs involved. As long as they're not incurred, they get forwarded to the next deal. If they've been incurred, they've been incurred.
Okay.
So like the valuation would be one that, typically until things are really solidified, I don't even order it unless they're under an incredible time frame.
Okay.
Time crunch.
All right, just to summarize, you've been at this for 25 years. You don't talk like a banker. You're a lender, not a banker, just to clarify. But
I don't know why I take offense to that. Like, I just don't want people thinking I'm sitting in a bank waiting to do, checking and savings deposits. I don't do that.
You're a lender, I know.
I'm a lender, and I happen to work for a division of a bank. Which
I know.
Finance division. So
well, you do a great job of communicating. You're helping people live the American dream, get their business sold. They build this thing and they want to get it sold. They want to get it sold for maximum value to a good buyer, and that buyer less money down, and they've got the lending process behind them, verifying through underwriting the financials, the tax returns, and an independent third-party valuation company looking at it. Not Joe and his team from Quiet Light Brokerage doing a valuation on the business. Somebody else that's independent that is backing up and looking at what we say and coming in where we are, higher, lower, whatever the number might be. So I think it's a great transaction. I think it's a great process. The SBA lending process has changed. It's a much, much bigger part of the overall number of transactions that Quiet Light does. So listen, man, the dog is saying it's time to end the interview.
It is time. We're out of time here.
He's got to go. He's got to do his business. We're talking business here, and he says, I got to do mine. Listen, man, thanks for your time.
Thanks for having me, Joe. I really appreciate it. And anybody out there, if you're interested in at least getting a little bit of consultation from me, you can reach me. Best way to reach me, you could either throw me an email at sspeer@bankunited.com, or you could reach out to me on my cell phone, 813-382-27 7543. Thanks again, Joe, for having me.
You're crazy. I don't think you gave me your cell phone number. Now I have it. That's great. All of your information for everybody listening or watching, we're going to have some links below in the show notes that will give your email, your phone number, your contact, the banking information, everything. We'll make sure it's there so people can reach out to you.
Great.
All right,
Thank you,
man.
Joe.
Thanks for your time, Stephen. Appreciate it.
All right. Cheers.